Hi everyone. I just wanted to do a quick video and talk a little bit about my new book. It's called Christ's Wait for Godot, A Theological Appreciation of Samuel Beckett. So I know it's a little bit of an atypical book for me. Those of you who may know me more from my Plain English series, where I examine different modern theologians and try to put them into plain language for everybody to understand. But this book is kind of the culmination of um, a deep appreciation for the literature of Samuel Beckett, for his novels, his plays, and his poems, combined with this suspicion that there's something more going on than just literature, that there's actually a lot of theological themes. And as I kept digging, I uncovered even more than I expected. Um, and so the book was something I challenged myself with. It's part literary criticism and it's part theology. So there's a little bit of both in there. The main focus is obviously Beckett's texts. I go through several of them throughout the book, but I do examine them from the lens of modern theology. My primary conversation partner throughout the book is Jürgen Moltmann. Um, I also get a little of Tillich and Barth and Bonhoeffer in there, as well as there's some interesting connections between mystical theology and negative theology with Beckett, and so I get into some of that as well. So I just want to talk a little bit through the 4 chapters in the book, just real briefly here, so that those who want to maybe are curious about the book or want to know a little bit more about it, they can kind of have a little bit of a idea before picking it up or deciding whether or not they want to read it. So the first chapter talks about the theme in Beckett's work of suffering and solidarity. And so Beckett's work is typically known for being quite bleak and a little bit dark, and sometimes even called nihilistic. But in my reading of Beckett, and as I've read through all the secondary literature on Beckett as well, I kind of came to realize what I'd instinctively known when I'd always been attracted to Beckett's work, and that is that nihilism is not the best description of his work, and the bleakness of his work is not just being bleak for bleakness' sake either. There's actually something more going on here, and what's happening is Beckett wallows in some of the darker parts of humanity, but it's not to just show how bad things are and then that's it. It's actually to a tremendous act of courage and affirmation to affirm humanity in its very darkest and its bleakest moments isn't just to be nihilistic, but it actually is even more beautiful than that in the fact that it elevates the everyday mundane and the suffering and all these things into a work of art, and it generates solidarity where we feel we're not alone in our darkness because we can sympathize with the tramps, Gogo and Dee Dee, waiting for Godot. We can sympathize with Beckett's characters and their struggle and their darkness and all these things that they're going through in their work. And so that's a profound element of his literature, but I immediately recognized with this a parallel between Samuel Beckett and Jürgen Moltmann's concept of God's co-suffering love, where God actually enters into and takes into himself the suffering of humanity. And so the open wound, which is a great phrase Moltmann uses, the open wound of suffering and evil is also God's open wound. It's not just our burden to bear, but actually God bears it in God's self, not only within God's own Trinitarian heart, but on the cross, obviously. But Moltmann makes a big point in his work, The Crucified God, that the cross event is also a God event, and we have to see it as such. And so that's the first theme I kind of get into. There's a lot there that I kind of unpack. That's the chapter I go through, Waiting for Godot, and a few Endgame, and a few other key texts. But the main thrust of that chapter is to focus on the suffering and solidarity theme within Beckett's work. Now the second chapter kind of builds on that, and it kind of studies what's called Beckett's protest atheism. That's a theme that should be familiar for people who have read Moltmann's work. And so it's basically the idea that there is a atheism that's not just simply the denial of God, but actually a protest against God for God's sake. And so within that, there is this kind of hidden longing for a God above God, to use Tillich's phrase, a God that transcends these idolatries of God that we create for ourselves. And so Beckett's iconoclasm against God is quite profound, and so I study it throughout his works. How it is studied in there, and as well as a few others. And this protest, this indignation against God, actually has a spiritual dimension to it. It's not just the refusal of God, the blank refusal of God, but there's actually something more going on. And so I examine that point as well as get into a little bit more of what protest atheism is, and then talk about how Maltman uses that concept in his own theology. And then in the third chapter, kind of building on that yet again, we get into the mystical and the negative theology elements of Beckett's work. And so there's a lot of profound parallels between how Beckett, for example, in the novel Watt, described one of the central figures as being kind of this nothingness that transcends his own presence. And so it's a similar concept with negative theology, where negative theology, its basic assumption is that we cannot speak of God. We speak of God by negation. We can only say what God is not. And so that's a interesting parallel there. And so I get into that some. Maltman comes in a little bit, but not as much as some of the other chapters. But we're mostly just talking about the concept and the methodology of negative theology, and then also some of the mystical themes that take place in Beckett's work. And so the main goal for that chapter really is to show how Beckett's spiritual sensibilities still were strong in all of his works. And so that's the third chapter. Kind of it deals with the theme of quest, which is the longing and the quest for the kind of like the pilgrim's path, I guess you could say, as well as the concept of deconstruction, which is that kind of sense of loss of faith and loss of certainty that takes place in a lot of Beckett's characters, as well as in faith. It's a profound concept of faith as well. And so we get into that in chapter 3. And then finally in chapter 4 is the concept of hope against hope. And so this is rooted again in Maltman, his theology of hope, and really all of his work has this cadence of hope. But it's not the kind of hope that we can give ourselves. It's not this cheap hope, but it's always a hope beyond hope, on the other side of the own kind of hope we have, and therefore it's rooted in God's hope for the future, and God's hope for the world. And so there's a lot of profound similarities with Beckett. There's the famous ending to The Unnameable, where the voice speaking in the dark says, "I can't go on, I'll go on." And that's how it concludes the book. And so it's this kind of dialectic between being unable to go on, but having the courage to still go on in spite of all the darkness and bleakness around us. And ultimately, that's kind of the conclusion I reached with a lot of Beckett's texts, is even though he wallows in this dark place, and he wallows in these difficult situations, and there's often just despair and hopelessness that seems to be central, really what's happening is this profound affirmation of humanity and the strength that we have to have courage to still go on, to still struggle through the mud, to still take one foot in front of the other, and to still hope in this paradoxical and absurd way, even in the midst of utter hopelessness and utter darkness. There's a fascinating example I study of Beckett's text, The Lost Ones, which is the later text, and my analysis of it shows that Beckett is actually revealing that utter hopelessness and absolute zero, the absolute negation of hopelessness, or the actual absolute negation of hope, is an impossibility. And so we will never arrive at that point. And so hope is that thing that just keeps driving us on, even when we don't know why sometimes, but it is this hope against hope. And so it kind of has a cadence that's similar to Maltman's concept of hope, as well as the Christian doctrine of hope, which is not a cheap hope either, because it is the hope that happens on the other side of the cross. It's not this cheap hope that comes without a cross. There is always the cross in the story. And so those are the 4 themes, like I said, the 4 chapters. I laid it out in this way just because I wanted to make it very clear that even if you're not familiar with Beckett, even if you've never read any of his works, I think that theologically and personally and just for life and faith and all of these things, there's so many of these big questions that Beckett wrestles with that he struggles with God and he struggles with truth and meaning in such a profound way that I think anybody can still take away a lot from this book. At least that was my hope. Obviously, I think fans of Beckett and fans of Maltman and theology and the combination of those two together would like it the most. But I do think that anybody that can pick it up, anybody that picks this book would still benefit from it. So I wanted to kind of give you that quick summary here and explain a little bit more about the book because, like I said, it's a little bit atypical for me. It's a little bit out there. And as I said before, I am happy with the book. I challenged myself quite a bit to kind of move out of my comfort zone and try a little bit of literary criticism here, try a little bit of developing my own theses about Beckett's work. And so it was many years in the making, and there's a lot of me in this book, and a lot of A lot of good stuff, I think, and I'm quite happy with it. And so I hope you take it, give it a chance, and read it. And if you do, let me know what you think. So again, that's Christ's Wait for Godot, and thanks for watching. Have a great day.